to disassemble, check, reassemble a three-phase induction motor. So this is our three-phase induction motor. It's 1.5 kilowatts and it has noisy bearings. So we're going to check the motor out, disassemble it, replace the bearings and then reassemble it. First off, we need to go up to our PPE gear that we need for this job. Now, because we're using a hammer and tools, we need safety glasses, a light workshop. So you can see here we've got plenty of light here. We need a nice comfortable height bench, and we need to use safe working practices to place the motor on the bench and disassemble it. A hammer, we need a bearing puller, we need a socket to fit the nut on the bearing puller, we need a shifter, we need a couple of large screwdrivers, flat blade screwdrivers, we need a Phillips head screwdriver, set of Allen keys, a shifter and a small set of sockets. We also need a megger to electrically test this motor out. We also need a centre punch. Now this motor has already been disconnected from the electrical supply and taken off its mount. It's a flange mount here, and this particular one has a coupling drive. So the first thing we do is we're going to put what we call witness marks on the motor before we pull it apart, because these motors can be reassembled the wrong way around. So with the witness marks is everything from one end that can be taken off, we're going to put one centre punch mark. So here on the flange, which can be taken off, we put a centre part, and then this is the end plate of the motor, so we put one on the end plate, and because the motor hasn't got a flange on this side, I'm just going to put a little mark there. So now by lining up the three marks, I know that this is the drive end of the motor, and on the other end of the motor I'm going to put two witness marks, so that now when we reassemble this motor, it's going to be the correct way around. First off, we are going to remove this coupling, which is the drive coupling. So we take our bearing puller, mount it on the coupling. Now the best type of bearing puller to use is a 3-jaw one, because it gives a nice even pull on whatever you're taking off. Okay, so we put our, and we tighten this up. Okay, so that's actually loosened the coupling off, so now it can be removed. So that's our coupling. Now we're going to remove the flange. Now pays to have a bit of cardboard handy. Draw your motor on the cardboard, and that gives you a place to keep the screws so you don't lose them. Okay, that should have loosened our flange up now. Give a little tap, it should come off. Okay, so we're going to remove the terminal cover. Remember that these motors come from hidden places, so a couple of things to watch when you're removing motors is some of them actually are pumping chemicals, so they could have hazardous chemicals on them, and some come from hidden places, so occasionally you could have a spider in there, so be aware of that. So we just check here to make sure that there's no bits of connection laying around or bits of wire that can actually work their way into the motor, because they normally come with links across here. Here's an example of one of the links out of one of these. So they could be in a star configuration where they'll be on this side, or in a delta configuration where they'll be this way. So we just make sure that there's nothing like that laying around in here that can work their way into the motor and destroy it. So now we'll remove the bolts holding the end plates on. And if you notice, these bolts have nuts in behind them, so we'll remove them so we don't lose them. Okay, so that's that end. Now we'll move to the other end. We'll take the cover off the fan. Now if you notice here, we have the fan in the end here. The idea of the fan is to suck air through here and blow it across the motor to keep it cool. Now these become brittle, they're very hard to get off normally without breaking them, so you've got to be very careful. So sometimes you can use a puller. Our puller won't reach into here and pull it out, so we're going to use 2 screwdrivers and be very gentle. There's 2 holes in here, so we're going to use the screwdriver and purchase evenly to remove our fan. So there's our fan. They're usually plastic and they're very easy to break because they become brittle. It's important that when you remove a motor and replace it with another motor, that the motor's going the right way. Now, if there's no signs on the motor or the machinery that it's joined onto, a good way to tell which way the motor's going is there'll be a build-up of rubbish on the side of the blade that the motor spins. So on this one you can see here that this side is all clean and this side's painted, therefore it would have been running this way. So that just gives you an idea of the way the motor was running. Now this particular motor has a seal to stop rubbish and a bit of moisture getting in there. So we'll just be aware that when we pull it apart that we look which way the seal goes. There's one on each end, and it's usually best to pull that seal off with the end plate. Now if you have a look on this end, we have 3 more bolts in here. The other side of these bolts will have a plate holding the bearing in, so we need to remove that. Not all motors have it, and some have different types. There's some are just a half turn screw, but these are threaded right in. Now we can disassemble the last cover. Okay, so now we can start pulling the motor apart. Now the best way here is we've got plenty of spots here to get our screwdrivers in. So if we go on opposite sides, so we're as even as possible, lever it out, so you notice here that the rotor here is coming out with this end plate, so we've got to be very careful that we don't damage the windings of the motor as we're removing the rotor. Here's the seal of the drive end. It goes in this way. It's still very flexible. If you're going to pull a motor apart, you're better off replacing the bearings and the seals so that you get the longest run out of the motor. So we remove that. Now we can remove the bearing out of the end plate. Okay, so here we have the bearings actually come out with the end plate. That's very rare. It normally is fairly tight on the rotor. So this is our plate which held the bearing in with those 3 screws, and there's the seal from the fan end. So now we need to get the bearing out of the housing. So we need to place this on a couple of blocks of wood. So if we use a pin punch, we can remove the bearing from the end housing. So here's our bearing. The bearing size is usually written on one of the end covers. If you've got no readings, then we'll grab the vernier calipers and measure the actual bearing. So now we can remove the other end. Again, we can have a bit of a look at the motor here. You can see that it's in good shape. It hasn't been burnt and there's no blow marks in it, so that looks pretty good. Okay, so here's our other bearing, and it's a 6205. Normally the bearings will be hard on there because that's normally the tightest spot. They'll normally come out of the housing and be on the rotor. So again, that's where you use your bearing puller. Like this to actually pull the bearing off. Now if the bearing is hard to get off, you can damage the bearing getting them off. So it's wise to replace the bearings once you pull them apart anyway. Okay, so this was our drive coupling, which connects it to whatever it's driving. I'd say this was probably a pump. This is the mounting flange. So this is how it's connected to the machinery. This is our end plate for the motor. This is our seal. This is our bearing, which slides back onto there. This is the rotor, so this is the rotating part of the machine. This is the stator. So the stator is the stationary part, and it has the magnetic fields. This is the backing plate for the bearing. This is the other end plate. This is our cooling fan, and this is just our cover for the end of the motor. And that's our seal for the fan end. Now for reassembly, it's important when you reassemble with new bearings that you put no stress on the bearing when you're reassembling it. So when you're reassembling the bearings, you need a pipe or tube that fits over the shaft and onto that centre part of the bearing, so that when you're actually tapping it back on, you're not putting any stress on the bearing itself. By hitting the outer part here, you're actually stressing the balls in the bearing, and you can damage the bearing putting it back on. So to reassemble this one, because we have an end plate up here, we're going to reassemble this end first. That way we can line up this plate. Making sure as you go that everything's tight. So now that we've got that assembled, we can now place this back in, being very careful not to damage the stator. Now if you look closely here, as I'm putting it back together, I see here that I have my witness marks. I have 2 there, and over here I have 1. So therefore I have actually turned the motor around the wrong way. Now we have the 2 witness marks. Now sometimes you may have to give it a little tap to get it into position, just using while we're at this point, we're going to replace the seal, and a wise thing to do is just run a smear of oil around it before you replace it. That also needs to be pushed into place by something similar to this. I'm just going to wind it in with my fingers this time. So there's the seal in the home position. It's important when you're doing these up that you don't just tighten one up first. Put them all in, get them started. Okay, we won't tighten them up yet, so we'll get the other end. This end had a spring washer which holds pressure on the bearing. No need to go all the way yet, because when we put the bolts in, they will pull it up. So now if we go alternate bolts to pull it together, you have a look up here, you can see how the seam has come together now. So that end looks pretty good. We'll now do the other end. Okay, so now that's all together. Before we put the fan on, we'll just make sure that it spins freely. And if you notice, it's... So what we'll do is we just give it a tap from either end. Which centers everything and makes it easy. Now we can put the fan back on. Make sure that it's not hitting anything. Put the end cover back on. Before I put this top cover back on, I'm going to fix these loose connections. I'm just going to check the connections, so I'm going to re-zero the machine. That's reading 5 ohms. That one's reading 5 ohms. And that one's reading 5 ohms. So that is all good. So now we can put the top cover back on. Remember, a smear of oil and the seal goes back in. Now, a little trick with these when you're testing a motor, this one still has noisy bearings because we didn't replace it. But just to check if the noise is coming from the bearing, you can use your screwdriver as a stethoscope by placing the screwdriver close to the bearing that you want to test and putting it in your ear and spinning the motor. You can hear that noisy bearing. Alright, so all we've got to do now is put the flange back on. Now if you watch over this side, you'll see as I tighten it up, the flange will come together. And there we have our motor disassembled and reassembled. So we just put our drive coupling back on. Now this is only a press on, so when you're putting something like this back on, you can either warm it up, heat it up, and then it will go back on easy. But again, when you're putting it on, use a piece of tube that goes over the shaft to hit it back on. So I'm not going to put it all the way home, I'm just going to place it on like that, because when they go to hook it back up on the machine, they can line it up properly. And that's it.